Hafaday, and welcome to this series about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. These episodes introduce the latest research and discussions about ancient life, history, and cultural traditions all across our diverse region of Micronesia. I hope that you like this series, and I look forward to learning more together.
What can we learn about clothing styles and practicalities during the early decades of Jesuit missionary interactions in the Mariana Islands around 1668 through 1700? Sandra Montón-Subías shares about her study of the historical records.
Have a day, everyone, and thank you, Mike, for this convention, for organizing this convention where we can learn about the Pacific. And thanks also for the invitation to share my work about the Marianas with you. I'm an archaeologist, and I have been working in Guam, mainly in Rhytidian and Humatac. But today, I would like to present a work that is mainly based on the information provided by primary colonial written sources. And I would like to discuss some of the body modifications that took place in the Marianas during the first 30 years of the Jesuit mission. And this happened within a colonial environment where the Jesuits sought to dismantle traditional lifeways while the Chamorus endeavored to preserve them. Some of the content that I will present can be found in these two articles, and it also forms part of the research project Averigua, which investigates the impact of Spanish colonialism on the indigenous Chamoru people. As you know, the colonization of the Marianas began as a Jesuit mission, and it is therefore important to have in mind that colonial missions were a form of colonization that went beyond the conquest of new territories and extractivism, because the main goal here was evangelization, and therefore this implies the colonization of subjectivities and ways of life. For the Jesuits, latte Chamorus were barbarians in need of civilization, and there was a huge cultural distance between the Jesuits and the Chamorus. While the Jesuits belonged to patriarchal societies, to European patriarchal societies, where relationships among their members were mediatized by social inequality, the Chamorus configured oral societies, most probably of matrilineal kinship, with a strong communal ethos. And this distance also embraced totally different corporeal habits. However, we have to have in mind that for both the Jesuits and the Chamorus, these corporeal habits were fundamental to their self-identity and to their sense of group belonging. The Jesuits who arrived on the Marianas, as well as other European explorers and missionaries who had previously been in these islands, interpreted Chamoru body habits as nakedness. And this was incompatible with the Jesuits' mindset, which linked body image with moral behavior and associated dress with civilization. According to the different written sources, textile manufacturing in the Marianas was consisted mainly of palm weaving and was made by women. And this craft was integral to Chamoru lifeways. And Spanish sources also say that this was one of the finest industries in Marianas. However, such praise did not include the few plated artifacts that were used for clothing the body, like, for instance, sandals, hats, and in the case of women, some tifis and skirts worn at female festivals. And you can see some of these plated artifacts in this image of the 17th century. The skirts, for instance, the female skirts, were described in a pejorative way as more like a cage than a clothing. And plated sandals, as we'll see later, were even used as a factor to express the Jesuits' mortification. So, in addition to plated sandals, hats, tifits, and the occasional skirt, Chamorros did not use any other fabric to clothe their bodies. And this is what the Europeans interpreted as nakedness. The dress was core to the Jesuit mission is illustrated by this quote from a Jesuit report that summarizes the first years of the mission until 1673. And the quote refers to the establishment of schools, an institution that was alien to the Chamoru tradition. These schools were fundamental for missionizing Marianas, as they were aimed at the children and therefore at the future. And in fact, the first things that the Jesuit did after constructing a church was to construct a school. And the first thing that they did at these schools, as you see in this quote, was to clothe children. And then they were threatened with punishment if they were seen and caught without their clothes. Within the same logic, clothing was also used as a reward for the best pupils. Schools not only made clothing compulsory, but were also workshops for teaching practical skills related to sewing, spinning, and weaving, and also making and maintaining clothes. Cotton weaving, sewing, and cloth maintenance fell mainly into girls' hands. And some documents reported that schoolgirls sewed to cover the needs of both the Jesuits and the schoolboys at Agaña, and that they also crafted their own clothing. And it is important to have in mind that technologies that imply more full-time specialization and mechanized work were allocated to boys. So, despite the efforts of the Jesuits, cotton growing was not successful in Marianas, and many documents insist on the recurring cotton shortage. And this shortage also affected the Jesuits and their clothes. It is said, for instance, that San Vitores, who was the leader of the mission, so it is said that San Vitores' soutane had completely faded and that he often arrived at villages wet without spare clothes. This shortage was sometimes managed by resorting to traditional Chamoru palm weaving, which seems to have provided clothing for both the Chamorros and the Jesuits. For instance, in this quote, Andrés de Ledesma wrote that for the Jesuit vestments, in the event of a shortage of other fabric, palm leaves dyed black shall suffice. In this second quote belongs to the eulogy to Luis de Medina. Eulogies were especially written when Jesuits were killed during the Spanish-Chamorro conflicts. And Luis de Medina was precisely the first Jesuit that was killed during these conflicts. And it is said that he wore an overcoat made of plated mats, and that this was very convenient because it had many different uses. And we have many other similar quotes in the Spanish documents. And always this clothing poverty is listed together with other difficulties, such as the lack of sleep or food scarcity. And it is made an opportunity for body mistreatment and mortification in line with the Jesuit vow of poverty. And a clear example of this is the use of palm sandals. As you can see here, palm sandals were sometimes considered even worse than walking barefoot, which is how the Jesuits decided to walk sometimes. And I find that this is very curious because later on in the 19th century, we have information from the Freycinet expedition that record that precisely these palm sandals were particularly appropriate for walking on the reefs. It is also interesting to see that in stark contrast to Chamoru perceived nakedness, some Jesuits decided to sleep in the same clothing they wore during the day. For instance, referring to Sebastián de Monroy, Gerardo Bouvens wrote that Sebastián de Monroy would not undress at night throughout the entire year. And in spite of the significant perspiration in that land and being completely soaked, he saw no reason to change into a dry skirt. He allowed his clothes to dry on his body. The introduction of clothing to cover the Chamoru body was not a smooth process, as you can imagine. It had different speeds and it provoked a range of diverse attitudes and reactions. And when we read from a critical perspective the written sources, there are various examples of Chamoru resistance to clothe their own bodies. And today I would like to concentrate only on the Chamoru resistance that was acted through the Jesuit bodies. For instance, this is a quote from another eulogy, in this case for Pedro Pavón, where Gerardo Bouvens praised his patience with the Chamoru, writing that one example among many was when an Indian, after he had dirtied his foot on some human excrement, went up to place where the brother was and, as a joke and scoffing, used his cassock to clean his food. In another eulogy, this time for Felipe Sonson, it is reported that Chamoru stole and burned the Jesuits' vestment. However, the most dramatic moments in the written sources involve when Chamorus stripped the Jesuits naked during fatal encounters. And for instance, in 1674, Francisco Ezquerra experienced this fate, as you can see here in this quote. And the narrative continues and says that he has to be left with a handkerchief that they were taking away. This was to recover the decency of his already naked body and in keeping a good grasp of a holy crucifix and an image of Our Lady, which the barbarians could not pry from his hands, no matter how they tried. Sometimes, however, these religious body ornaments were also destroyed on purpose, and as for instance, this happened with San Vittore's death. In my understanding, undressing the Jesuits may have had or may have served as a form of punishment and rejection, having at least the same force as the murder itself. It is interesting that the Chamorros punished the Jesuits in the reverse manner than the Jesuits had previously punished them, with nakedness. It is important also to not forget that these body modifications, both for Chamorros and for the Jesuits, transpired within a colonial context and not in a cultural encounter where both parties enjoy equal footing. In contrast to the Chamorros, the Jesuits were shaped by various axes of social inequality and ranked among the most individualized logocentric members of the 17th century. They actively sought to impose their own desires upon the Chamorros, thereby changing the course of their destinies. And it is also important to have this in mind. While the Chamorros had previously integrated European castaways in their bodily habits, the Jesuits did not seek to incorporate Chamorros into their own habits because these were part of their identity as Jesuits. Instead, the Chamorros were to be attire in the garment befitting the less affluent, thereby expressing and constructing their new place in the unequal social structure of the emerging colonial society. Consequently, despite both Jesuits and Chamorros undergoing alterations to their bodily practices, they did so under very totally different circumstances. The imperative is what drove the Jesuits to change their vestments, no? Because they have to adapt to local conditions without colonial imposition and the coloniality of being that characterized the experience of the Chamorros. See you, Masi, and thank you very much, and muchas gracias.
Thank you for joining us in learning about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. If you would like to learn more details, then I encourage you to visit, in person or online, the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam. Thank you again for watching this program. I hope that you will continue to explore and discover more.